Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am delighted to welcome onto the podcast Sharon Bennett Connolly to discuss Scotland's medieval queens. Sharon Bennett Connolly is an elected Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and best-selling author of historical non-fiction books. Her latest book, Scotland's Medieval Queens, is book number 8. As well as writing the popular history blog, History, The Interesting Bits, Sharon co-hosts the podcast A Slice of Medieval alongside historical novelist Derek Burks. She regularly gives talks on women's history for historical groups, festivals, and in schools. Her book Silk and the Sword, The Women of the Norman Conquest, is a recommended text for teaching the Norman Conquest in the national curriculum. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Sharon. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm babysitting today. I've got my mum's two dogs until Sunday because mum and dad have gone away for a couple of days. So I'm babysitting two German schnauzers who they're lovely, but they do like attention. And one of them, her favourite place in the world is my lap.
Oh.
So I've had to surgically remove her for an hour, and she's not happy.
It sounds like my dog. No, don't move me. Could you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
About me, I absolutely love history. And I did a degree at Northampton that was a combined studies degree. History, business and law, because I was being sensible and doing business and law as well as history. But I always wanted to do history, even though I first worked at Euro Disney and then at Eurostar, mainly used my French rather than my history. But after having my son, my husband bought me a blog one Christmas in 2014, and I actually started writing History, The Interesting Bits. And from that blog, I got a contract to write my first book, Heroines of the Medieval World. And I have literally now just finished writing my 9th and 10th books. It was supposed to be my 9th book, but it's too long, so it's turned into 2 books, which are the Princesses of the Early Middle Ages and Princesses of the Later Middle Ages. And both of those will be out next year.
Well, that sounds really exciting. And you had to make 2 books. That is even better.
Yeah, it was, the contract was for 95,000 words and it came in at 143,000 words. So my editor said, rather than trying to get you to cut 20 or 30,000 words, why don't we just turn it into 2 books? And I was like, yeah, that's a good idea.
What was the inspiration for Scotland's medieval queens?
It's a funny one, that one, because it was my son. And it was his English GCSE class, English literature. He came out of school one day. They were doing Macbeth as part of their GCSE. And he came out of school one day and said, Mum, you have got to do something about Lady Macbeth. Set the record straight. Shakespeare did a horrible job on her. She doesn't even get her name. And Richard III has got a society putting things right for him, but nobody's bothered about Lady Macbeth. And her name's Gruach. And everybody should know. And I said, well, actually, there's not enough information on Lady Macbeth to do an entire book. Because, it's 1,000 years ago. I said, oh, I could do a book on Scotland's medieval queens and give her a chapter. And he says, you need to do it, Mum. So that's how Scotland's medieval queens came about.
Well, you were certainly told by your son what to do.
Yes, it was. I mean, I wanted to anyway, because there are a couple of the queens in my first book, Heroines of the Medieval World. So, and most of my books do actually follow on from heroines of the medieval world. So I thought actually I could, it actually, he told me I needed to do it, but it was like actually, it was something in the back of my mind anyway, because I love Scottish history. It's so dramatic and there's so much of it. It's fascinating. So it was like he was telling me to do it, but I was like, yeah, I didn't need a lot of persuading.
What did you enjoy the most about writing this book?
I love the research. I absolutely adore doing research. I probably, if I was given a choice, I'd probably do research 24/7 and forget writing the book. But I actually do, I enjoy writing once I've got over halfway and I can see the ends coming. But when you start a project, it's like 100,000 words just seems so long, so much to do, so much hard work. But whereas researching, I can just carry on doing that forever, and I love it. And then you find out about these women who everybody just overlooked for so long, and you're bringing their stories to life, and I love doing that.
Could you tell us about some of our earliest examples of Scotland's medieval queens?
Well, the first Scottish queen we have who we absolutely know the name of is Gruach, Lady Macbeth. And I mean, Shakespeare was not kind to her. He made her into a murderess, somebody who is so ambitious she persuaded her husband to go around murdering everybody and then went mad from persuading her husband to go around murdering everybody. And that wasn't her at all. Um, she was married twice. Her first husband had killed Macbeth's dad, so Macbeth killed him, which would have been an interesting start to a relationship because she then married Macbeth. And she had a son with her first husband called Lulach, who Macbeth adopted and raised as his own and actually named as his heir. And Lulach did rule for a very short time after Macbeth's death. But we know very little about Gruach. We do know that she was a member of the royal family, and her marrying her would have strengthened Macbeth's claim to the throne. She was a mother. She went to Rome with Macbeth on a pilgrimage, and which shows that Scotland was fairly peaceful for most of Macbeth's reign, because no king would leave a kingdom that's in the midst of civil war. So, with the play, you have this idea that Macbeth's always fighting for his throne because he's not actually entitled to it. Whereas in real life, he had a long period of stability, so much so that he could leave the kingdom and go on pilgrimage to Rome, which was a big thing in those days. Canute did it as well with his wife, Emma of Normandy. But it also shows that they were religious, sophisticated, and culturally aware of what was going on around them, and also of what's beyond their own borders. You often think in those days everybody was insular, nobody left their village, let alone their kingdom. But Macbeth did that. So, and Lady Macbeth went with him. So yeah, they seem to have been a very comfortable couple together. Unfortunately, we don't have an awful lot of information about her. Like I say, it's 1,000 years ago. We don't even know when she died or where she's buried, which is a shame. But it is an indication of exactly what it was like being a woman in medieval times, because nobody took much notice of you at all unless you did something really significant and usually bad. That thing, bad women make history. And it's like every woman made history. It's just not everybody wrote it down. They just ignored the history made by women a lot of the time. So Gruach is the first lady in the book, and the second is St. Margaret. Margaret of Wessex, who was a granddaughter of Ethelred II of England and was around at the time of the Norman conquest. Her brother, Edgar the Atheling, was proclaimed king in 1066, but didn't manage to seize or hold the throne ahead of William the Conqueror. So he took his sisters up to Scotland, and in return for financial and military support from Malcolm III of Scotland, Edgar persuaded his sister Margaret to marry him, to marry Malcolm. And Margaret wasn't keen on it. She was a very religious lady. She'd been raised in Eastern Europe and then educated in a convent in England when her father had been brought back from exile. And she would have been very happy to spend her entire life in a convent. But her duty was to marry and to marry Malcolm III because she had the blood of Alfred the Great in her veins. So there was no wasting that in a convent. And she couldn't stay in England because William the Conqueror would have married her to one of his cronies, to make and one of his really loyal cronies because she had the blood of Alfred the Great in her veins, and anyone marrying her would have had the claim to the English throne. So she was a very powerful lady, and in her blood, but she was a very strong, independent lady as well. She was well educated. She basically reformed the Scottish Church so that brought it in line with the Church of Rome rather than the Columban Church, which was the other side of the Scottish Church. And yeah, she would have arguments with priests and things like that. So, and held her own against them.
I mean, it's fascinating to me that we, even though we don't know loads about these women, we still know their names 1,000 years
Yes.
on. I think that's still incredible.
Yeah, it is. And it's good that we do because it gives you the personal view. I mean, history for a long time was just about the kings. And it's like, no king lives, just with men. It's never just been about men. If women weren't there, history would never have been made because you'd have one generation and that would be it. There'd be no women, no next generation. So it's nice to be able to point out that these women were there and they were involved. They didn't just, I think we've all had this view through the way the education system has been over the years that women just, especially medieval women, sat sewing and raised babies and that was it. And it's like, can you imagine your husband or your boyfriend not listening to you when you're sitting there, you're doing your needlework and he's discussing politics and you're like, oh, I don't know. It goes way over my head because we're all just simple brained as women. Yeah, right.
Could you tell us about Margaret and why she is nicknamed Maid of Norway?
Oh, that's little Margaret. Oh, bless her. She is such a tragic story, and yet she was the first um proclaimed queen regnant in England, in the British Isles. We have Empress Matilda in the 12th century, but she was never actually proclaimed queen. Whereas Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was proclaimed queen, and yet she was only a child. She was about 3 years old when she was proclaimed queen when her grandfather died. She was the daughter of Margaret of Scotland and Eric of Norway. And her grandfather, Alexander III of Scotland, had had three children, two boys and a girl. Unfortunately, all three children died before he did. And his wife died even before them. So he was left with no heir. He married Yolanda de Dreux in order to try and get another heir. And unfortunately, he was racing through the night, through a dark and stormy night after a council meeting to get to his bride so that he could spend her birthday with her. And somehow his horse lost its footing. He fell off and broke his neck. So suddenly we have Scotland, after having so many heirs, it had three heirs at one stage, and there's suddenly no heirs, and the king's dead. So the only heir that Alexander had was his granddaughter, Margaret of Norway. And of course, she was in Norway because she's only a baby girl, she's with her dad in Norway. Her mum died when she was born. So she is literally this one breath away from the Scottish throne. So she is proclaimed queen. She's only a child, and Scotland's barons make this deal with Edward the First to guarantee Margaret's safety. And Edward the First's idea is that Margaret marries his son, the future Edward the Second. So if that had happened, we would have had England and Scotland united in under one crown 400 years earlier than we did. But unfortunately, Edward made this deal with Eric of Norway, saying that he would guarantee Margaret's safety if he sent Margaret to Scotland to be crowned. And Margaret gets in a boat when she's about 7, 8 years old and is brought over from Norway to her coronation. Unfortunately, she suffers from seasickness en route, and they have to put in at a place that's now called Margaret's Hope, where unfortunately she dies, probably from dehydration or maybe poisoning from food going rotten on the voyage. But she dies before she's crowned. And the problem with that now is that she was the only heir to Scotland. And all of a sudden they have to find a new king. And they have to go back through the generations to find who is the senior claimant to the throne. And there's something like 13 men all competing for the throne of Scotland. And they all go to Edward the First and say, well, do you mind adjudicating? And Ed was like, oh, no, I don't mind. I mean, we've got this image here of Edward. He's already subjugated Wales. And now it's like he's got this opportunity with Scotland. And he's always seen it as the invader of Scotland. But right at this point, this is in 1390, Scotland and England have had 70 years of peace. Nobody thinks Edward the First is going to come and be too heavy-handed. He's just there as a peace to keep the peace and make sure that everything's done properly. But he decides on John Balliol as the next King of Scots, who is technically, he is the grandson, the great-grandson of great-great-grandson of David II. David the First, by his grandson David. And so it's really hard to explain, but there's this Prince David of Huntingdon, and his eldest daughter had a grandson named John Balliol. His second eldest daughter had a son named Robert Bruce. So Robert Bruce was the other main claimant. Now, he was closer to the Scottish throne in that he was one generation nearer it, but from a younger daughter. So John Balliol was from the oldest daughter, but a generation separated. So technically, through technical primogeniture, then went to John Balliol, and he got it. But Edward I liked the idea of John Balliol being his puppet, and doing what he wanted. And John Balliol didn't like this idea. And in the end, Edward I decided he'd had enough of John Balliol disobeying him and basically dethroned him and decided he'd rule Scotland himself, and that's it. He'd be King of England and King of Scotland. Now, the Scots didn't really like this, which is why they have this declaration of our broth, where so long as 100 of us remain living, we will never subject ourselves to the English yoke, sort of thing. And then you have Robert the Bruce fighting for the crown, and you have William Wallace. William Wallace was fighting to put John Balliol back on the throne, whereas Robert the Bruce was fighting for himself. And in the end, it was Robert the Bruce, who is actually the grandson of the competitor who was opposing Balliol. He eventually does claim the throne in 1306 after accidentally murdering John Comyn, who was a supporter of Balliol, in a church in Dumfries. And then Bruce then has to race to Scone in Scotland to get himself crowned before the church excommunicates him for murdering somebody in a church. They frown upon that. They don't like it.
Could you tell us?
So I'm just saying, I'm hoping that made sense, because it's a really difficult time in Scottish history to explain.
No, I mean it sounds really
It
complicated.
is.
Could you tell us about Elizabeth de Burgh?
I can. Elizabeth is Robert the Bruce's wife. Now, she was only about um, 13, 14, 15 when she married Bruce. She's his second wife. He already had a daughter from his first wife, and but in Scotland, they didn't really, after the example of Margaret of Norway, they were pretty keen on not having a girl take the throne. So Bruce remarried to Elizabeth de Burgh, who happened to be the daughter of one of Edward I's best friends. Because what you see with Robert the Bruce is he wasn't totally pro on the side of the Scots all the time. But then again, not many Scottish lords were because they were part Norman as well. De Bruce is actually a Norman surname. So he was on Edward I's side for some of the time against John Balliol and things like that. But eventually he decided he was going to fight for Scotland. Um, and in 1306, after murdering Comyn, he was crowned at Scone on the 25th of March with Elizabeth de Burgh by his side. Now, Elizabeth de Burgh, although she wouldn't have even been 20 by that point, she was quite perceptive, and she actually referred to herself and Robert as the King and Queen of the May, suggesting maybe that she thought that they weren't going to last very long because if they've got the power of Edward I coming down on them, and possibly as a prediction of what was going to happen to her, because by the end of the year, she and Bruce's daughter, Marjorie, two of his sisters, and Isabel Buchan, who had placed the crown on Robert's head, had been captured by the English and sent south to imprisonment that would last for 8 years. Now, the problem with, I mean, this was Edward the First and then Edward the Second after him, showing the power of the English. You know, they've captured Bruce's wife. So they're taunting Robert the Bruce that he can't look after his women folk because they've got his wife, his daughter, his sisters. But they're also preventing him from having an heir because he can't have an heir until he's got his wife with him. So it's like they're preventing an heir offers security and stability to a crown. So they're making it really difficult for Robert the Bruce. The problem for the English was that Edward I was succeeded by Edward II, and he was nowhere near as skilled at making war as his dad was, and nowhere near as skilled at getting loyalty from his barons. So in the end, Robert the Bruce beat Edward II at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, captured a few highly prized English nobles, including Edward II's brother-in-law, and managed to negotiate the release of his wife and daughter and sisters, and finally got his wife back. Now, at this point, he is desperate for an heir. So he's got his wife back. So they have two daughters between 1315 and 1323. So they're trying for children. But just in case, he marries his daughter, who's been in English captivity for 8 years, Marjorie, who was about 18. She's married to Walter the Steward in the hope that if Elizabeth de Burgh can't get an heir, then at least Marjorie can. And Marjorie does actually give birth to a baby boy before Bruce's wife does. So his grandson is his heir until Elizabeth does eventually have a son in 1324, who's named David. So you have this period, this situation in the 14th century in Scotland, where David's the heir of Robert the Bruce, but his older nephew is his heir. And David didn't actually like his nephew Robert either, so they didn't get on very well when they became adults. Because I think David always felt when Robert the Bruce dies, David is sent to France for his safety again because the English are at war with them again, and Robert stays and fights. So I think David feels a little annoyed that he didn't get to stay and fight because he was still a child, where Robert was a teenager and capable of doing it, but it caused problems for the monarchy later on. But yeah, Elizabeth de Burgh, her 8 years in prison, then when she comes back, she's trying desperately for an heir, and she does produce one in 1324 and then another son in 1327, and then she dies on the 27th of October 1327. Possibly, although no one says it, it's funny that there's a son born in 1327 and then she dies. So I think it's probably complications of childbirth, because she's also, she's getting on. She's in her late 30s by this point as well, which is more dangerous in those days for a woman to give birth. Now we're more used to it, but in those days she was getting on a bit.
Could you tell us about Joan Makepeace?
Yeah, oh, I feel for Joan. Have you noticed I feel for most of these women? But yes, we mentioned Elizabeth de Burgh and Robert the Bruce's son, David, who became David II when his dad died in 1329, by which point he was 5 years old and had already been married for a year. And he was married to Joan Makepeace, who was the daughter of Edward II, Edward II of England. And when Edward II was deposed in 1327 by his wife and her friend, Roger Mortimer, his wife Isabella of France, as Queen of England, negotiated a peace with Robert the Bruce, basically because there was so much unrest and trouble in England. She didn't want to have to worry about the Scottish border at the same time. So she negotiated a peace with Robert the Bruce where Scottish sovereignty was recognised. Although Bruce had won the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, they were still technically at war with the English because the English would not relinquish Scotland. But Isabella of France acknowledged Scottish independence and Scottish sovereignty and sealed this Treaty of Northampton with a marriage between David and her daughter, Joan Makepeace. She was actually called Joan of the Tower at the time. She got the nickname Makepeace because she married David II as part of a peace treaty. So in 1329, these two children, she was 2 years older than David, became King and Queen of Scots. They're the youngest married couple, married King and Queen in British history. Thank God. It didn't happen that often that they were so young. So they had a long marriage, but they don't seem to have been very happy. I mean, thing is, once they'd got married, Edward III, who was Edward II and Isabella's son, spent 3 years under the yoke of Isabella and then decided to actually exert his independence. And part of his independence was actually, I don't actually approve of the Treaty of Northampton. He wasn't at his sister's wedding because he didn't agree with this treaty. So once he got his independence from his mum, one of the first things he did was cause trouble in Scotland by supporting John Balliol's son Edward against his sister and her husband. So he financed Edward Balliol and sent him north to Scotland to claim the crown, even though the crown was sitting on his sister's head. You've got to feel for poor Joan. And no wonder the marriage didn't actually work out exactly as she liked. It didn't help that David and Joan never had any children either. And that David was captured by the English at one stage and imprisoned in England for a little while. And in the end, Joan just had enough, and she actually came south to England in 1357, 1358. She came to England and she stayed. She literally left her husband and came to live in England and spent the last 4 years of her life in England. She and David never had any children. And to be honest, it looks like that was David's fault. David never had any children. He had a string of mistresses. He married again after Joan died, and he never had any children. His heir was his nephew, Robert Stewart, who was older than him and had a nursery full of children as well, which must have been really frustrating and annoying for David. He couldn't have one baby, and his hated nephew Robert, just had to look at his wife and got her pregnant.
Is is the reason why their marriage worked probably because of the political situation going on between England and Scotland?
I think so. I think it put an unbelievable strain on the marriage, and it can't have been easy. It was forced on them when they were babies. So they were raised together from early childhood. But there was always this, her brother didn't want her to be married to him, but it was done and dusted. And, they're fighting a war against the English, and she's English. It's just, you just look at it and you think that poor girl, what she must have gone through, knowing that her brother hated the marriage, her own people were fighting the country she'd been married into. And she's got this nickname of Makepeace that the Scottish gave her after she married David II. And it's like, well, that's not working either, is it? And she does try her best, and you notice she does write to her brother Edward from time to time, trying to negotiate peace. When David's imprisoned in England, she takes part in some of the negotiations for David's release. David doesn't help himself an awful lot either in order to facilitate his release. At one stage, he's captured at the Battle of Neville's Cross, and he tries to negotiate with Edward III, and he agrees to make Edward his heir just so that Edward would release him. But he's got to get the approval of the Scots. So he goes back north, and of course the Scots don't approve. So he has to go back into captivity. And he's having these affairs as well. One of his mistresses, he started a relationship with her when he was imprisoned in England and took her back to Scotland with him. But nobody liked her, apparently, because somebody murdered her, So, and then, yeah, and he was having a relationship with a lady called Margaret Drummond when Joan went back to England. And after she died, he married Margaret Drummond. And then he tried to divorce her as well. And he died in the process of divorcing her. So I'm not sure David was the nicest of people either.
It doesn't sound like it.
No. I think he's one of those examples of somebody who, he was 5 when he became king, and he didn't have the influence of his parents to teach him how he should behave and things like that. So he had a lot of challenges, bless him.
Can you tell us some later examples of our medieval Scottish queens?
I can. One of my favourites. Well, actually, there's two. I've got two favourites. One is Annabella Drummond, who was the wife of Robert III. Now, Robert III was a very tragic king because he was the son of Robert II, the one who was the grandson of Robert the Bruce, and he was given the name John when he was born. So he was, for most of his early years, he was John, Earl of Carrick. When he became king, he decided he didn't want to have the name John because everybody could still remember John Balliol and how that turned out. So he took the regnal name Robert III instead. The problem was he'd been acting as regent for his dad for a little while and hadn't done a good job. He'd also been kicked by a horse at one stage, and his leg so badly injured he hadn't healed properly, and he was lame. So he seems like very much like a lame duck. The lords of Scotland wouldn't allow him to rule. They set his brother, the future Duke of Albany, as a guardian to the kingdom, and until his oldest son Robert was old enough to take the reins. And then that eldest son was murdered by the Duke of Albany. And Robert's younger son, James, was sent to France for safety, but captured by pirates off the coast of Scarborough and sold to the English and had spent years imprisoned in England. All this time, Robert's married to this young lady, Annabella Drummond, who is the niece of David II's second wife, Margaret Drummond. But the relationship seems to have been, although you'd think that that this marriage forced on him wasn't great. It was a lovely relationship. And Annabella seems to have been Robert III's backbone. You know, she pressed for him to get more autonomy. She advanced her son's position over her husband's brother. And she seems to have been a really strong, supportive wife. But unfortunately, she died before, after her son was killed, and before James I was sent to France. And so, and once she died, Robert seems to have just lost everything. You know, he actually said that there was a quote. He said that he would be the most miserable of kings or something like that. I should have looked it up before I came on, but I've just remembered it now and I can't remember exactly what it was. But he was full of self-pity by this point. So that's Annabella. And my other favourite is Annabella's daughter-in-law, James I's wife, Joan Beaufort, mainly because this is one of those things you don't see in medieval history. It's a royal love story. James was the captive prince, and Joan Beaufort was the cousin of the king. And she used to walk her little dog in the gardens below the tower where James was held captive, and he'd drop a rose down to her or a little note down to her. And well, that's the story anyway. Whether or not it's true, I don't know. And he wrote a poem called The King's Quair, describing Joan. So it looks like he really fell for her. And when he was released from English captivity, one of the conditions of the release was that he married an English lady, and it was Joan who he married. And they went back to Scotland together and had a brood of children before, well, James pissed off too many Scottish people, mainly because he took revenge on the fact that he'd been held in prison for something like 19 years while his uncle and his cousins were ruling Scotland rather viciously. So he took his revenge when he got back, and everybody got a bit upset about that. So they then took their revenge on James, and he was resting in his wife's rooms when he heard soldiers break in to come and attack him. And he tried to escape down this sewer. Sewer. Unfortunately, he'd had that locked up because he kept losing his tennis balls down there. So he'd blocked it up. So when he went in there to escape, there was no way out and he was murdered. So not a very happy ending for a love story, but it was a lovely love story while it lasted with Joan Beaufort and James I.
You have a chapter about Scotland's Renaissance queens. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, that's the last two of the queens, because of course we were getting into 1450s onwards, we get into the Renaissance, you know, the invention of the printing press, the start, the moving towards the Reformation. And you do see a change in the information we have about the queens, I suppose. The first one is Mary of Gelders, who was married to James II. And she and James II seem to have had a really good relationship. The only problem was when their son, James, the future James III, was about 8 or 9, James II was besieging Roxburgh Castle and stood too close to a cannon that was firing at the castle. Unfortunately, it exploded, and a piece of the shrapnel broke his thigh bone, ripped through his thigh bone and killed him. So the one thing you learn about Stuart Kings is they didn't live very long. There were a heck of a load of regencies from James I onward. The first two, Robert II and Robert III, they're fine. But then after that, you get a regency after regency. And James I gets murdered. James II is killed by a cannon. James III, his son James IV was a little older. He was a teenager. So they didn't have a regency for that one. But then James IV to James V, there's a regency. And I mean, then you've got Mary, Queen of Scots. She was, what, 6 days old when she became queen. But James II, he died after being struck by a exploding cannon. And Mary of Guelders was acted as regent for her son, James II. No, James III. Where am I? Yeah, James III. Sorry, it's all these Jameses in one row. And she acted as regent at a time when Scotland was fairly secure, but England was in the midst of the Wars of the Roses. And Mary of Guelders very cleverly realizes or knows that something that the Scots have always known. An unstable England is the best thing for Scotland because it means they're not invading Scotland. So she cleverly tries to take sides in the Wars of the Roses, so to keep basically England on its toes. So she first supports the Lancastrians. Margaret of Anjou has just basically lost everything. Her husband's on the run, and she and her son Edward seek sanctuary in Scotland. And Mary of Guelders welcomes her, even arranges a marriage between her daughter and Edward of Westminster, Henry VI's son. But she gets pressure from Burgundy, who are pro-Yorkist, to side with Edward IV instead. And this is the 1460, 1461, 1462, when Edward IV has just claimed the crown. And it's all looking like hopefully he'll keep it, but we don't know. So she's hedging her bets. But then Burgundy, the Duchy of Guelders is part of Burgundy. So, and she was raised at the court of Burgundy. So when Philip of Burgundy says, actually, I'm friends with Edward IV, Mary, so you should be friends with Edward IV rather than with Queen Margaret. So Mary says, oh, okay then. So she sends Margaret packing, tells her basically, gives her a little money and says, I can't look after you anymore. And does a treaty with Edward IV instead. And so she's a very wily politician. And the interesting thing is she has a partner in this who is Bishop Kennedy, the Bishop of St Andrews. But he is pro-Lancastrian, whereas Mary eventually is pro-Yorkist, but they still work together. And although when she's alive, Kennedy's like, no, we need to be with the Lancastrians. We need to be with the Lancastrians. When Mary dies in 1463, I think it was, instead of pursuing his own aims, Bishop Kennedy respects what Mary's done to the extent that he changes sides then and goes pro-Yorkist because that's what Mary's policies were. So it just shows how well respected she was as a Queen of Scots and as a regent.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests 5 fun history questions. So my first question is, have you got a history pet peeve?
Can I only have one? That's not fair. The one that really gets to me is every now and then you hear either King John was destined for the church as a child or Henry VIII was destined for the church. Because they were younger sons. They weren't going to rule, so they were destined for the church. Total bull. Not true. There's no indication that either of them were destined for the church. Yes, John was educated at Fontevraud Abbey for a while, Henry VIII was really well educated, but there's nothing to say they were destined for the church. And the argument is, well, younger sons joined the church. Younger sons of the nobility might have done. Younger sons of the English royal family didn't. Though no younger son, no prince has ever joined the church in England. Illegitimate sons did, but not princes. They did it in France, but not in England. But every now and then you hear this, oh no, they were destined for the church because that's what happened with younger sons. And it's like, no, it isn't. So there's my pet peeve.
Do you know what? I have never really thought of it until you mentioned it. I do hear that, like, oh yeah, Henry VIII, because he's the second son, he's going to be in the church. Was he?
No, well, that's the thing. No, there was no example of it. No, no.
If you could go back in time to any event or day in history, when and where would it be and why?
I think my answer is probably most people's answers, which is the day the fate of the princes in the tower was decided.
Hmm.
I'd just love to know what happened to them, whether they lived, whether they died, whether they were moved out of the Tower of London. I'd just love to know. Just love to watch the moment where what happened to them happened.
Yeah, no, I think it's. I've not heard it as often as you think on the podcast, actually.
Really?
Okay. No, it's usually sometimes the feel of the cloth of gold,
Mm.
which
Yeah,
the
that
print.
must have been spectacular.
But the more I think about it, when was it decided we need to do something about the princes? Was it in
Mm.
Richard's
What
reign? Was it
happened to them?
Henry's? Like,
Yeah, I'd just love to see the moment that we just find out what happened to them.
have you got a favorite book? It can be non-fiction, fiction, or you can have two.
I have my favorite book I have had since I was 9 years old. I got it for Christmas when I was 9, but it is an adult book and it's called The Kings and Queens of Great Britain. And it doesn't have all of them in it, but it has beautiful colour photos and images of some of the best, Robert the Bruce is in there, William the Conqueror, Queen Victoria. And the book, I mean, it's nearly 50 years old. It's the sleeve is very dog-eared and well worn, but the rest of the book is in pristine condition. And I have taken it with me everywhere. I took it to university. I went and worked for 6 months at Euro Disney in Paris, and that was one of the books I took with me. It's still in, and I still use it for research as well. Because, like I say, although I was only 9, it's not a child's book; it's a proper adult history book, and it is just beautiful, absolutely wonderful. And yeah, that's my book.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
It would be Nicola de la Haye, who was the lady who defended Lincoln Castle during the First Barons' War when King John was beset from all sides by rebels and French invaders. And she defended the castle. She was the first woman to be appointed a sheriff in her own right in England. And she was in her 60s when she's defending this castle against invaders. And I wrote a biography of her a few years ago, and I would just love to meet her and get to know her and ask her why, when everybody else was turning against him, why did she continue to support King John?
No, I've never heard of this woman before. That's the first on the podcast for her name to be mentioned.
Well, it's my book, King John's Right Hand Lady, the story of Nicola de la Haye. And she is an incredible woman. She defended Lincoln Castle 3 times on her own. She was quite a formidable woman and definitely deserves her place in history.
And finally, have you got a favourite historical fact?
I've been umming and ahhing about this all morning and going between them, and I was thinking, yes, that Magna Carta was sealed, not signed. And then I thought, no, my favourite historical fact is that 1141, during the anarchy, the year is known as the War of the Two Matildas because King Stephen had been captured So the Stephen's army was being led by his wife, Matilda of Boulogne. And of course, the other side is Empress Matilda. And so you've got these two women, cousins. They're cousins. Empress Matilda is both Stephen's cousin and Matilda of Boulogne's cousin. So it's definitely a cousin's war. Um, but these two women are leading the armies on both sides, the opposing armies, and that it's just called the War of the Two Matildas. And I only discovered that as I was writing the Women of the Anarchy book, and it was like, okay, that's great because that's a chapter heading in there on its own.
Well, that's a really interesting fact, actually.
Yeah, exactly. It's like because I hadn't heard of any war being named after two women before. There is another one actually. There's and during the War of the Breton Succession, there's the War of the Two Jeannes because there was Jeanne de Penthièvre and Jeanne Flanders leading opposing armies as well. So the idea that women are leading armies, I like that.
Thank you so much for coming on today. And well, frankly, you've educated me, so you're gonna have educated our listeners today as well.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it, Jess.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.